Today, I had a great conversation with Simran Jeet Singh, Executive Director for the Aspen Institute's Religion and Society program. Simran's thought leadership on bias, empathy, and justice extends across corporate, university, and government settings. He is the author of the national bestseller, The Light We Give: How Sikh Wisdom Can Transform Your Life, which lays out how we can all learn to integrate ethical living to achieve personal happiness and a happier life. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Simran, welcome to the podcast. Before we dive into your book, The Light We Give, would you be able to give the listeners a brief background and bio about yourself, and then we'll talk our way all through your life and through some lessons that people can take away?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Simran Jeet Singh. I'm a Punjabi Sikh who was born and raised in Texas. And so not many people looked like me where I grew up. And that informed a lot of my experience with racism, but also in terms of diving into my heritage and trying to understand, why we're different, what it is about our culture and tradition that my parents found to be so valuable and worth preserving. And so that really shaped my life. And the other thing I have to say is I'm a big sports fan. And so I don't always lead with that, but it's March Madness over here in the States right now. NBA playoffs are coming up. And so it's a good time to be a sports fan right now.
So I'll digress with you for a minute because we were in San Antonio 2 weeks ago and we saw your beloved team.
There we go.
Let the Grizzlies have the 15th greatest comeback of all time. So Spurs were up by 29 at half, and the Grizz came back and won it in overtime. It was a very, very interesting game to watch. It was our first trip to Texas. We saw the Mavericks and we saw the Spurs, so it was a lot of fun.
That's great. And do you have a Vancouver Grizzlies affinity? Does your love for the Grizzly go back?
My love definitely grows back because I've grown up here in Vancouver and I was a big Grizz fan, and I always assumed that when I got a full-time job, even though I was probably a bigger hockey fan, I assumed I would get Grizzlies season tickets for life because from an entertainment perspective, I enjoyed basketball more than I did hockey. And then by the time I graduated college, they were gone. So that took away that opportunity. But my son is in love with John Morant, so he had his Morant gear ready to go until we found out that he had an 8-game suspension. So we never saw him in the game. Yeah.
Oh, too bad. Oh,
yeah, cool. It was still fun. So the first question I want to throw at you at the book, I'll read a small section of your book because I believe it aligns with why we're having this type of conversation you and I are having in the value we receive from them. So that'll help us kind of outline things a little, and then we'll leave it to you to color in for the listeners. And that is, you wrote, "I have grown immensely by opening myself up to the world, rather than being judgmental about different perspectives and ways of living. I am now intrigued and curious. Why do you think so? What experiences inform that outlook? Taking this approach feels that there is more to us than the attributes we are born with, or our experiences at the surface. We all have it in us to journey together to our shared interior, to the inner struggles that make us human and that we hold in common. Traveling together can help us make meaning of ourselves and our world, and can help us find answers to questions we never even thought to ask."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, appreciate that. I've done a lot of these conversations around the book over the last 6 months or so. Nobody's raised this particular passage, and so it feels fresh to me as you're saying it, especially because in our tradition in Sikh wisdom, we revert to the power of Sangat. And if you break that word down into its component part, it basically means your community who helps propel you forward. And it's an integral part of what it means to be someone who's looking for progress, that it's not a it's not just an inner exercise. It's not an isolated exercise. Everything happens in community. And, I understand that from some of the great wisdom traditions that offer a similar perspective. I was just in Thailand with my family, and Buddhism is incredibly popular there. And one of the key precepts there is Sangha, a similar root to this term Sangha, and it's so core to Buddhist practice. And so, anyways, as you're talking about this, I'm thinking a lot about our culture today, where rather than looking from a communal perspective, we're so focused on the individual self. And it's so hyper individualized that sometimes any kind of interaction can be perceived as regressive, as a barrier to progress. And more than anything, I mean, sure, you could go one way or the other and say, I'm going to do this by myself, or I'm going to go with people. But what I find is the ways in which we are engaging with one another these days is to shut ourselves off and to shut other people down. And that's the part that to me just feels so, I want to say harmful, but it's not even just harmful. It's like you're not even giving yourself the chance, and you're not even giving other people the chance to really engage. I mean, we're saying we're connecting, but we're not really. We're saying we're engaging the other, and we're not. And instead we're looking to just prove why we're right and they're wrong, or why we're better and they're worse, or whatever it is that, makes us feel good about the choices we're making. And so to me, it's just a different way of living that I draw from Sikh philosophy. And I mean, I really learned it through the actions of my parents and my family and people around me, who just showed me what it means to open up, even when it would feel so much easier to shut down. And through that act of opening up, you can open up the people around you too, and create something far more powerful.
The other two important concepts from Sikh wisdom that you talked about early on that the gurus would speak about that will probably inform a lot of what we talk about is first, the importance of lived experience, learning from those who've achieved what we want. And second, knowledge for knowledge's sake, being simply intellectual curiosity, and the actual value being the actions we take from the knowledge that we get. Can you dive a little into those two and why they've been so foundational in your life, and why we want the listeners to really be focusing on those two things?
Yeah, it's something I think about a lot, because I'm trained as a scholar and as a historian, and it's a big part of my worldview, how I've been trained to understand the world. And so much of what the culture of intellectualism is to collect, it's to hoard, it's to know, right? And to gather as much information as you can. And one of the striking, moments in my life as I'm looking at Sikh teachings is, I'm collecting this information with the intention of using it to help people. But as I'm looking at the writings from the Sikh gurus, over and over again, they're so critical of scholars. And they're critical of them because of their egos. And they're like, you just think you're better than everyone. Like you have this immense base of information. You also have this great privilege, like culturally, historically, access to information was a unique privilege for people of certain castes and classes. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, hey, what's going on here? Like, I'm supposed to be the good guy here. I have all the right intentions, but there's something I need to be careful about. And it was in reading some of the writings from the founder of Guru Nanak, where he's talking about, you could read boats full of books, you could read houses full of books, you could read libraries full of books. Like, none of that matters at the end of the day if you're not using it to better your life and the lives of people around you. And there's this one really compelling incident that happens in his life where he meets not just intellectually accomplished people, but really spiritually accomplished people. And he's out meeting them. They're ascetics. They've renounced the world. And he goes and sits with them. And they're interrogating him. And he looks at them and he's like, yeah, I'm impressed. I'm impressed by your accomplishment spiritually. Like you've reached a really high level, and that's great for you. But also, who cares? Like, what difference are you making in the world? And what difference does that make? Any of your achievement make if you're not making a difference in the world? And I love that point. And I find myself feeling it over and over again. And I understand it's not for everyone, but for me, as someone who's been raised not just in this religious tradition, but also as someone who's been raised here in the US, in the 90s, in the 2000s, in a context where it really feels like there's some urgency around finding answers to some of our social ills. I kind of hear this call as saying, hey, there's no hiding, there's no pretending. Like if you're not serving people, then you're kind of missing the point. And so that lesson is something that I always carry with me.
That's beautiful. And so you mentioned growing up in Texas in the 90s and 2000s. So if we rewind the clock, something I want to zone in on with you, Simran, is as a child, you and your brothers experienced a fair amount of racism. And then September 11th, 2001 happened, and the level of that racism for you, your family, and people of the Sikh faith in America went up exponentially. Can you talk our listeners through what it was like growing up with that, and then that transition point, and how much stronger it became after that?
Yeah. Well, okay. So if you're listening, I'm a practitioner of the Sikh faith, and as part of my practice, I maintain uncut hair. I have facial hair. I wear a turban on top of my head as part of my religious practice. My family comes from a region in North India called Punjab, and so I have brown skin like a lot of South Asians. And so growing up in Texas, in a place where not many people knew who we were or what we were about, it was pretty common to get questions, to get looks, to be denied service, to hear people say nasty stuff. It sort of ran the gambit, and so you can probably imagine the kinds of assumptions that people were making about us. And part of what I want to say, and this is something that I share in the book too, like, it's not to say that my childhood was terrible and just like the only thing I experienced in life was racism. Like there was a lot of goodness, far more goodness than difficulty, I would say. And at the same time, like the difficulty was real and the racism was real, and it would come up often enough that we never really were under the illusion that we fit into society as much as we felt like normal Americans, and we were born and raised here, and we're friends with people who looked like the people on TV that you would assume to be American, right? Like that was our life. It felt very normal. And at the same time, we knew that most people didn't think that we were normal or typical as Americans. So it was very much a part of our experience. We were very aware of our visible difference, our cultural difference. But things really shifted after 9/11 and immediately that day. And, I would say they didn't really shift between my friends and I, even my classmates or my teammates and I. Like they all knew who we were and what we were about, and our relationships stayed the same. And in fact, in some ways, they got a lot stronger because our friends started to show up for us, and really seeing the hate that was coming our way, they were going out of their way to help us out. So like that created a lot more trust. But for the most part, the larger experience across America, and this was true for me too, among strangers, like the day that the terrorist attacks happened, September 11th, 2001, we started getting death threats that very day. And part of what I didn't understand at the time, or at least, I understood, but didn't quite understand it in this way, was that my physical appearance happened to match up very closely with America's perceived enemy, right? Particularly bin Laden. But as Americans are watching on their screens the death and the destruction, and associating that with the images they're seeing out of Afghanistan with Al Qaeda, with the Taliban, brown skinned men like me with turbans like me and with facial hair like me. Like, I came to understand that we were very much public enemy number one. And, we received death threats. There weren't actual attacks, at least in the immediate days after 9/11, that affected my direct family in our house while we were locked up there. But there were many Sikhs around the country, many whom I know, who were attacked, who were assaulted, who were killed, just because people couldn't control the anger in their hearts, and also because they weren't culturally literate enough. I mean, I guess that's a very nice way of saying they were ignorant, right? They didn't know who we were. They assumed us to be their enemy, and they came after us. And so that was a turning point in my life. And I'll say pretty directly, my life hasn't been the same since 9/11, 22 years ago now.
And you were, at the time, you were 17?
That's right. Yeah, I was a senior in high school, just starting my senior year.
And the next thing that happened for you is, when you were in college, you came to a realization that most of the Sikh practices that you had been following had not necessarily been from a place of, hey, I'm a deep believer in this, and you actually had a feeling that there wasn't practical value, that it was outdated and inferior. And that prompted you to say, well, wait a second, why don't I dig a little deeper in to my religion and into the past of our people? Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was a very, I wouldn't say it was inevitable that I would come to this point, but given the context of American racism and the intensity of the hatred that was coming my way, it felt really inevitable, right? It felt like if I could make a different choice and just took off my turban, life could be a lot easier. And I thought about my parents, and I thought about my grandparents, and for them too, they could have made that same choice. And so I was thinking to myself, as a 20-year-old, I was just like, what's the point of all this? And it's not like I didn't understand the basics of Sikh teachings or practice, and it's not like I didn't agree with them. Like, I thought they were fine and they made sense to me, but it didn't seem like, I to put it in like really crass terms, like I didn't really get the ROI, right? Like, what am I'm giving up something really big here, right? Like, I'm not able to fit into society, and what am I getting in return? And I wasn't really sure if it was worth it. And so I really started to, I mean, I wasn't questioning it from a place of a lack of faith. I would say it was more like, is this a choice that I want to continue to make? And in order to have an honest answer, I wanted to dig in honestly. And so I started studying Sikh teachings for the first time in earnest as a 20-year-old or so. And I was actually quite surprised by what I found. The teachings made a lot more sense to me than I thought they would. I mean, like you mentioned, and I share this in the book, like I really expected, I think the same bias that a lot of us have. Religion is outdated, outmoded. It's for people in a faraway place, in a faraway time. And like, what practical value can this ancient tradition have on my life, where, the people who were talking about this stuff and developed these ideas didn't know me. They didn't know the unique aspects of our lives. Like, they didn't have the internet. They didn't have cars. Like, what could they possibly know about what our lives would look like? And so it never really occurred to me that it could be relevant and helpful in the way that it turned out to be. And so that was a really, I guess, a pleasant surprise, I could say, for myself, where in the years since, I feel like I've just been so enriched by this wisdom. I mean, I've in many ways committed my life to it, not just as someone who follows it, but as someone who studies who studies it in a personal way, but also academically, and tries to share it with others now too. So yeah, it was an unexpected outcome of that experience, but I'm really glad that I approached it with this openness to saying, let me give it a chance and see if there's something here for me.
And there's a power to that questioning in that you don't just take blindly, well, this is what I was taught while I was growing up, so it's the only way, which is something I often bring up with people I know to say, well, wait a second, you believe in Christianity because you were born a Christian. That person
Yeah.
believes in they're a Muslim because they were born in the spot they were born in. None of us can for sure say if we were born in the other person's shoes that we would still practice the faith that we practice. So for you to say, well, let me actually take a step back and study this to see if this is what I want to spend the rest of my life doing is a very noble gesture and way to approach it. And for the listeners, because we're using the proper pronunciation, they may not be as familiar with what we're saying, which is the Sikh faith or Sikhism as the anglicized word. And I believe in the book, correct me if I pronounce this wrong, it's Sikhi or Sikhi.
Sikhi, yeah, appreciate
Sikhi.
that. Yeah.
So that would be the right way for us to do it. And so what I saw in the book was founded in 1469 CE by Guru Nanak, who was searching for at the time joy and purpose. And the three areas he was looking for that through were spiritual growth, ethical living, and selfless giving. Can you share a bit of that history with the listener? And then we'll dive into some of the details that you learned along the way on your journey from the faith.
Yeah, for sure. I'd say the Sikh religion was founded by Guru Nanak about 550 years ago. And so, in the grand scheme of things, it's a relatively young religion. It's the youngest of the major religions. And it emerges in this context that I actually think is quite similar to what we're dealing with right now, which is, the region he was born in and where he primarily focused his life is Punjab. And in that region, it was at the time immense cultural mixing, religious diversity, ethnic diversity, linguistic diversity. I mean, all sorts of people coming together and trying to figure out how to live together, and a lot of tension. And those tensions are very much governed by social hierarchies and outlooks of supremacy, right? This judgment of I'm better than you, or I'm holier than thou, or however it's articulated. And he sees this context and he sees how much people are struggling, how much they're frustrated, how angry they are, how unfair it is. I mean, again, very similar to what our lives look like today. And he sees that and he's like, I think I have a better answer. I have a way of living alongside one another where we don't have to be judgmental, or we don't have to be hierarchical, or we don't have to be supremacist. And so he offers this principle, which becomes the foundation of everything in Sikh teachings. And that's the principle of Ik Onkar, which means the oneness of all creation. And, in some ways, it's super simple, right? Like so many of us could share this idea and wax poetic about it. I mean, it's not that complicated. I have young kids. They get it. I mean, as a young kid, I got it, right? Like it's a very intuitive way of understanding the world. And at the same time, both then in Punjab and now here in North America, I mean, it can be incredibly profound because it's so countercultural to say, hey, our starting point is one of connection. And then we start exploring our differences. Whereas, I mean, even if you look at our conversations in spaces like DEI and so on, like we're so focused on our individual identities. And we say, okay, let's understand those, and then maybe we can connect with one another. And so it's just a simple shift. It's almost like he's inverting the approach and saying, instead of starting from your sense of self, instead of focusing on your individual identity, let's start from this place of shared identity where we are all connected. This goes to your point, the passage you shared earlier from the book, where I'm really talking about what does it look like to journey together. I mean, that's part of the experience, and the possibility that Guru Nanak is offering here, where he says, yeah, you are important, but you're no more important than anyone else. And also, by the way, no one is more important than you. And what does it look like for us to get to a point where we could see ourselves in one another? And that's what this principle that Guru Nanak offers, and that's the seed of this tradition that then flowers over the past 550 years and blossoms in the way that we're seeing it now.
And so when you say that, it's so interesting because, yes, it sounds simple. It sounds intuitive, starting from a place of we're all one. We're all a collective. We're all the same. And there are times when you're deep in a meditation that you get there and you're, oh, I'm there. And then it just collapses back and you're like, oh, I got to get back there. But then when you take away that meditation or you take away the training and you look at the way we're all raised and the way the human brain works, is we're wired to look for differences rather than look for similarities. And as we get older, it seems like not even just the ego, but then it's the us, and there's always a them. And then the social media and the news and everything seems hardwired to create an us versus them narrative, whether it's the left versus the right, red versus blue. I believe in global warming. I don't, right? There always has to be, it seems, a camp in just forcing separation instead of a message that brings us closer together.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. I mean, it's something I think about a lot, because if you look at some of the ugliest forms of social tension today, it comes out of that mindset of there's an us and there's a them, right? Like tribalism, nationalism, and then we're seeing all kinds of ugly ethnic, religious nationalism right now. Like I'm dealing with this week. I'm writing about some issues in India where right-wing nationalism has taken hold, and I'm also dealing with some stuff here in the States where right-wing nationalism is taken, and like so much of that relies on a narrative of a threat, right? Like we need to be worried about these people, and that's what we use to coalesce around, right? It's based on that fear. And part of what I'm looking at as I'm reflecting on my life, and I write about this a little bit in the book too, is for the past few decades here in the States, we have been fed this narrative of fear. I mean, we've been in the war on terror since I was a kid. And it, like the constant rhetoric around terrorism and the use of these fears to then justify all kinds of violations of human rights. I mean, I'm done with it. I'm so tired of it. And so what does it look like for us to get to a place where we can actually learn to love our enemies? A next step that we need to figure out how to do, right? Like we know how to talk about it. We all know that that's an aspiration, but we don't know how to get there. And so the actual practice of doing so is something that I've learned through my life as someone who's been targeted in hate and has had to figure out, well, how am I going to live so that I'm not just angry at people all the time? I'm not falling into this negativity. Let me say one other thing, which is part of what Sikh philosophy offers is a more robust vision. It actually asks a very different question, right? So in Abrahamic tradition, so often we develop this model, and in the West we talk about loving our enemies as the aspiration, as the best place for us to go. And I do think it's a great aspiration. But what Sikh philosophy tells us is actually we can get to a place where we don't have any enemies at all. Guru Arjan talks about, he has this line, na ko badi na hi begana sagal sang humko banyai. He says, I don't have any baddie, I don't have any enemies. Nahi begana, I don't see any strangers. Sagal sang humko banyai. Everyone I see as part of me. Like, these are all my people. And I think to me, that's the ultimate goal, right? Like, how do we get to a place where even when people see us as their enemies, right? Like, just think about me walking down the street and like all the time people are looking at me being like, oh, that guy's my enemy. And how can I get to a place where I'm not affected by their perceptions of me and I can still see their humanity? And I think a big part of what I want to share in the book, and a sincere belief that I have, is that we can actually get there. Like, we can actually get to a place where even when people hate us, even when people don't see our humanity, we can love them and we can see their humanity anyway. And like, it doesn't have to be a reciprocal relationship. It can be something that we can own and control and maintain, at least with our own integrity. And so, yeah, that feels like such an important message that I'm trying to share through Sikh teachings.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me. There's two things I've always seemed to drive more hate. One is fear. Two is ignorance. And you write about the same with ignorance. And so the more we can expose humanity and people of different faiths to each other and to each other's story. I think guest I recorded with last week, he was talking about an example where they tested out Americans' feelings towards Muslims, and they had one group watching a show, I believe it was Little Mosque on the Prairie, and compared that against the control group, and their feelings towards Muslims were a lot more improved because they had exposure to the faith through watching a simple television show. So how are there ways that we can create, and a lot of people will say what we're saying now is wokeism, but all we're saying is, hey, let's expose each other to different people, different faiths, different backgrounds, so that when we experience it in the real world, we don't experience it from a place of fear, ignorance, and then hate.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think this is part of an opportunity that a lot of us have that we take for granted. And, I can speak from my own family history. Like, up until my parents immigrated to this country just before I was born, they lived in an ethnically homogenous place, and so did their parents, and so did their parents. And so, like, I am the first person in my family who's born into a society where I get to engage with people who are different from me. And I can tell you, yes, it's a challenge in so many ways, right? Like, it would be in some ways easier to live alongside people who got me and I didn't have to explain who I was or why I wore a turban. Like, those kinds of things would be different in the way that my parents experienced growing up in Punjab. But first of all, that doesn't seem very fun to grow up alongside people who are, just going back to this point about what drives progress, what drives growth. And I know this is what you're thinking about on your program and what your listeners are interested in too. And like, part of what drives my growth is being in constant relationship with people who challenge me. And it doesn't have to be like someone being like so purposeful about asking, hey, do you really think it's not about the actual like explicit challenge itself. It's about the relationship through which you're just observing and hearing new ideas and seeing how people live and being like, oh, that could be cool. And like, I mean, here's a really random example that's coming to my mind. We just went on a family vacation with another family, which first of all, I'd never done before. So very, very risky. But part of what, and they have kids about the same age, which is part of why we decided to go with them. And as my wife and I were watching how they parented, we got ideas on things that we could incorporate in our own family. And what was interesting was a few days into the trip, they said to us, "Oh, we're watching how you're parenting. We got some cool ideas on what we can try to do." And like, we weren't explicit, like we didn't tell them, "Hey, you should do this." They didn't tell us how we should parent either. But just by being together, we were able to learn new things. And so like, that's kind of what I mean about the value of just being in relationship with people who are different from you, who you can learn from and who can help you grow. And like, that's exactly what I felt through this experience. So it does feel like a real gift, a real blessing to have this opportunity to be around people who are different from me, because it's a constant opportunity to learn and grow and challenge myself to continue towards progress.
It's one of the biggest reasons when our boys are old enough that they leave school. Our goal, my wife and I, will be to live somewhere else in the world 6 to 7 months of the year and just go deep into that culture, learn the language, learn what they do in that area, travel to a new area. And so each year, come back to Vancouver. May to September, it's probably the best place in the world to live. Outside of that 5-month time frame, I don't want to spend any time here. And so that other 7 months, let's travel the world and let's learn and grow and expand. And just to your point, it's just immersing yourself in what you don't already know. And then you learn what you don't know, which is beautiful. And that's so much fun on that battle. The next area I want to dive in with you is coming out of tragedy. So it was the massacre at Oak Creek. When you were doing some searching for the pain and anger that you were dealing with, the Sikh wisdom that you leaned on was three things. One was how we feel, which I may pronounce it wrong, is Chartikala. And then you had how we see, or the divinity that's inside of us all. And then how we connect, which you talked a little bit earlier about, we are all one. And can you educate the listeners how we feel, how we see, how we connect? And we can dive through each of those ones and see what you were able to take away dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because what I shared and the order I share them in the book is not how they're presented in Sikh philosophy. Like, it's not like this is a chronology or a progression of, you do this step and then you do the next step. But they were almost like observations that I was making in trying to deal with my own anger and frustration after the massacre. And the first one that really got me and surprised me was the one of how we feel, of Jardikala. And it's a term that I had heard all throughout my life. We say it every day in our collective prayer. We ask for the upliftment of all humanity. That's what Jardikala means, uplifted, eternal optimism. And so it's a concept I was familiar with and had talked a lot about. But in this moment of tragedy, I was really shocked to see the people who were most directly affected, the community in Oak Creek, coming out with the spirit of Jardikala and talking about it openly, that this is who we are and this is how we're choosing to respond. And so I came to realize that it is a choice that we can make, even in our most dark moments, even in grief. We can make the choice to see the goodness, and watching these people finding that. And again, they were there on the ground. They had lost family members. They had lost loved ones. To see them be able to do that, I was like, oh, okay. Like, if they can do it, then I can do it too, right? And so there was something really inspiring about watching them model this what up until this point, for me at least, had been more theoretical, right? Like, it's the idea was great, it was beautiful, but could I actually apply it in my life when the tough moments came? And and watching the community do it made me feel like, yeah, actually I could, because I started to feel confidence that I could, because I was seeing that they figured out how to do it in this moment. So that was a really a powerful one. And then going on to how we see and how we connect, it's really going back to, it's almost like the working backwards, right? Like, if the possibility and the promise is to find light in the midst of darkness, then it's almost a question of how. Like, how do we do that? And really, it's, at least what I've learned through Sikh teachings, is we have to learn how to shift our thinking, and the way that we look at the world, so that when we're experiencing it, we can start having a different feeling, having a different interpretation of what's happening that then impacts our experience. And so all of this, I think, can sound almost artificial, right? It can sound really constructed, as in, here you're trying to manipulate the system and just say, whatever happens, I'm going to be happy. And in a way, I'm like, yeah, that's that's the trick. And also, I would say, especially in a context where we're talking about things like toxic positivity and, brushing difficulty under the rug, like, I think that's what's so compelling about this approach of Chardi Kala, which is basically saying, acknowledge the difficulty, like, the pain is real, and don't dismiss that, but also recognize that within that pain, there's also the possibility of light and sweetness. And that, I think, to me, is where I find this approach to be really compelling. It's honest, it's sincere, and it's also hopeful at the same time, which is very different than how a lot of us are thinking about these issues right now.
It's beautiful to me in that it ties into other major historical philosophies, religions, if you will, whether it's Buddhism, whether it's Stoicism. There's that concept of, why get hit by the arrow twice? The arrow was fired. Yes, we got hit, but now we get to mentally choose how we deal with getting hit by the arrow. We can let it hit us a second time in our mind, or we can choose to feel a different way. And so it's that power of recognizing that we get to choose how we feel, how we see, and how we respond to the pain. It really struck me as a beautiful way to approach it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'll say again, like, I understand that it can sound super cheesy, and that it can sound forced. I mean, I get that. I actually hear it as I'm saying it, but I'll also say that if it's coming from a place of sincerity, it's not actually forced, right? Like, you can sort of develop a habit and build the muscle, to learn to view the world in this way, and it completely transforms your experience, especially in those moments of difficulty that can feel so hard otherwise.
Well, we'll fast forward a bit in the book, because when you talk about building the muscle, one of the things that does help with that, because in order to be able to choose how we feel, we need to be able to separate a gap between, hey, we had a stimulus. How are we going to respond to that? And one way we build the ability to have a gap there is through meditation, which is core to the Sikh religion, but you had largely put it aside for a number of years. And then when you were older, decided, hey, wait a second, I'm going to start practicing this again. So what did that look like for you to bring meditation back into your life? And what are some of the benefits that you personally have seen? And then why is it so central to the Sikh religion?
Yeah. Yeah. I'll share something that maybe a little bit unexpected from someone who's talking about religion, but like, prayer, I think, which is an important part of many religious practices, including my own. For so many of us, we see prayer as a way of influencing what the world does and what happens to us in the world. And what I believe, and what I see to be the power of prayer, is actually not the change that occurs in what happens, but actually the change that occurs within ourselves. And I think that, to me, so let me say, in Sikh scripture, one of the lines we repeat every day essentially is, you can talk about how great God is, it's not going to change God. And you could insult God, that doesn't change God either. Like, what difference does it make if you're praising God or not to God, right? Like, are you really going to influence God? And like, the answer to me is an obvious no, right? Like, who are we to think that we're going to change? If you want to take it out of explicitly religious terms, like, who are we to think that we're going to change the natural order of things, right? Like the cosmic law, the rules of the universe. Like, we're not going to defy gravity, right? Praying about it. And so to me, the transformation is not about changing what happens in the world, but like, what is happening inside of you through the practice of prayer. And again, like, I don't believe in, these like magical things happening where you say the right thing and all of a sudden the rules break and the right things happen for you. Like, I don't think that's how the world works. And I don't think that's how religion works. What I see happening, though, is something, I mean, you could describe it as alchemy, but the way that I would describe it is actually in this way. One is a focusing in on aspiration, right? What are the values that we're repeating? What are we identifying as our priority? And as we're identifying that as a priority, that surfaces what our behaviors are going to look like. And so when we are beginning to align our behaviors with our intentions, that's how we become the kind of people we want to be. And that's the transformation, right? That's the magic. But it's not, it matches up far more closely with the behavioral science that we have available to us, which is, you are a collection of your habits. You are what you do every day, right? Like, Aristotle said the same thing, and James Clear is saying the same thing now, 2000 years later, right? Like, oh yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that's been my experience of this. And the last thing I want to say about this is, one of my more transformative experiences actually came through running, and not because it was like a spiritual high or some mystical experience. Like, I specifically just mean through discipline. And I share this in the book as well, that the disciplinary practice of running, I found, changed me internally to the point where it was easier for me to make the right decisions because I was mentally stronger. And I think that is another aspect of prayer and ritual and disciplinary practice that's something really powerful that we could all tap into.
I've always said, for a lot of people who find that they can't achieve goals in their life that might be academic or might be mental or financial, start with physical: running, triathlon, marathons, ultra marathons. When you teach yourself to do those hard physical things, you aren't only teaching yourself to do hard physical things, you're teaching yourself, I am the type of person who can achieve things that I put my mind to. And so for you, running, I've had the exact same experience in my life through a number of, generally, the longer the event, the more punishing it is. Just the idea that, well, if I can complete that, there's not much I can't do. And something for you that taught you that idea of who I am versus who I want to be during COVID, you came to a realization when your wife said something to you. It made you realize, what does it say about me that I've always talked about living this way, but never actually lived it? So what did that look like for you as it related to what was going on in life? And how did that change how you prioritize your life?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, I'll say very openly, like a lot of other people, I realized that I had been pointing my finger at everyone who said one thing and behaved in a different way, right? Like they say this is what I care about or what's most important to me or what my values are, but then you don't actually see it and you're like, oh, you're a hypocrite. And this moment for me that I share in the book and that you're mentioning is one where, I had young kids, I had babies, and basically over and over again, I'd become so good at articulating that my biggest priority was my family, that the most important thing in the world to me was taking care of them and being with them and spending time with them. And so one of the experiences that I had was starting to recognize that actually, even when I was with them, I wasn't fully present. And all my decision making, I was picking work over spending time with family. And it was, I guess this is the funny thing about life. Like, it's so obvious when it's other people, but when it's yourself, maybe you're too close to it. I don't know what it is, but like I had no idea. It was just, you normalize whatever your behaviors are. So it was totally normal to me. It didn't occur to me. And finally I had to, basically do some introspective exercise to understand what was going on and where the source of my unhappiness was. And this is how I was able to put my finger on this misalignment of priorities between what I said mattered and what I was putting my time towards.
It brings up that adage, show me what someone does and I'll tell you what they care about.
Yeah.
Which,
yeah, exactly.
if you also look, you were talking about Sikh scripture, and I found fascinating that one night you were reading and there was a line that you'd heard as a child, read throughout your adulthood, and said aloud for every night of your life when you add it all up. But it hit you differently this night. And the line was, in remembering, I live. In forgetting, I die. What was
Yeah.
it that just struck you so differently for the first time? And do you still feel that way? And can you share that with our listeners?
Yeah. Yeah. I guess what was different was up until that point, I'd always done like a simple translation of it, like something more direct, which is maybe it's not direct, but like this is the sort of standard translation is like, when I meditate, then I'm living, and when I'm not meditating, I die. And like for someone like me who hasn't been someone who would sit around and just meditate, like doesn't really resonate so much for me, right? Like if you're saying when you meditate you're happy and when you don't meditate you're sad, I'm like, okay, cool, like go meditate then. Like if it makes you happy. I went into a more direct translation, I guess, is what hit it different. Instead of relying on the way that other people interpret it, I was just looking at the original language and reflecting on it. And I was like, oh, actually, this isn't just about meditation. Like akna is literally to think about or call out, to reflect on. And I was like, there's so many things that I think about all the time. And the ones that I love are the ones that make me happy. Like I feel alive. Jiva is to live. So akha jiva, when I think about this, I'm living. And, here it's specifically about the divine. But like in my personal life, I was like, oh, when I think about sports, I feel alive. When I think about my partner, I feel alive, right? Like these things that I love, that's what gets me going. And when I don't think about them, like when I lose sight of them or I lose perspective, then I'm like, then I don't feel like myself. And so it was this, I don't know, almost like a rereading of it where I let go of what people told me it meant and just interpreted it for myself and started to make this connection that like, actually, this is just about a relationship. Like it's just a relationship of love. And like, that's what love looks like. When you love someone, you're excited when you're around them and you feel alive. And when you're not, then you feel sad and like you want to recreate that experience. And so, yeah, it was a total, it totally messed with my head to think about it in a different way and to realize that this had so much more depth to it and resonance for me in a way that I'd never realized before.
And if we stay on that line of love and selflessness, there are two quotes that you shared in the book that were both beautiful. So I'll throw those out to our listeners, and then you can share what those mean to you and how they impact your life. The first one you had was from C.S. Lewis, who said, "Humility is not thinking less of yourself. Humility is thinking about yourself less." And the second one was James Baldwin, who said, "If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." So, how did each of those resonate for you enough that they're in the book?
Yeah, I mean, they're in the book and they're like mantras in my life that I return to often. You know, the C.S. Lewis quote, I shared this in the book. Like, I struggled with humility for a long time. And I wasn't quite sure how to understand humility without being self deprecatory, meaning like I would just think of myself as like I thought being humble would be to be beneath other people and to think of yourself as being inferior to them. And so I would develop that mindset and like then I'd walk away feeling really proud because I was like, oh, I'm so humble. But I didn't really realize that that's not healthy. And it wasn't until I came across this quote from C.S. Lewis that I found a better way, which is something that's more balanced. Maybe it's more intuitive for a lot of people. But this quote, you know, humility is not thinking less about yourself, but thinking about yourself less. It's such a nice play on words and got right to the like pinpointed the specific challenge that I was struggling with personally. The quote from Baldwin is one that also, I mean, changed my life in a lot of ways. But in some ways, I think it also pinpointed something for me that felt important, and that's around education. He says, "If I love you, I have to make you conscious of the things you don't see." Like that's how I think about education now. Like that's my point as a professor and a writer. And the starting point, if you'll notice in Baldwin's quote, and this is what felt so special about it for me too, the starting point is love. And then that is what's driving your action. And in Sikh philosophy, that's the best way to engage. It's not about activism itself. It's also what's in your heart when you do it. That's what we refer to as seva. And so I just loved that Baldwin was able to share for us what love can do in an educational perspective and in all sorts of forms and all sorts of audiences, but really like what is the relationship between love and education and justice? And that really nailed it on the head for me.
It's beautiful too, because if you have friendships or relationships where you have that level of love and care for each other, that you point out blind spots and you don't let your friend, you don't let your partner or your sibling or your family member continue to make the same mistakes without at least saying, "Hey, I don't know if you noticed, but this is
Right,
something
right,
I
right,
see."
exactly.
Right? So let's go back to young Simran, who's in the grocery store with his mom and makes a little bit of a mistake involving a Snickers bar. And that night, your mom said something to you that I thought was beautiful. She said, "There is nothing sacred about looking like a Sikh." I remember her saying, "Your turban is a public statement that you wear on your head. It's a crown that announces to the world that you will always do the right thing. If you're not willing to honor that, then maybe you should think about not wearing it." How did that tie into your life with the respect of, we talked about the importance of not only having the knowledge, but of doing the right thing to respect the knowledge. So how did that shape you in your life?
Yeah, I mean, it was a profound moment for me. I mean, a very embarrassing story for me to tell. I'd never told it to anyone until I wrote this book. But yeah, it was a profound moment for me because it really helped me to understand that wearing a turban meant something, and also there were ethical implications tied to it. And you know, it wasn't the first time that I'd heard something like this. But it was the first time that I heard it in this way, and in a way that gave me a sense of the urgency of ethical practice. And essentially, like the takeaway for me as a kid was, hey, people are going to see you, they're going to judge you, and they're going to judge your entire community based on your actions. And so if you're announcing to the world by wearing a turban that you follow Sikh values, then you better try. Like you don't have to be perfect, but like you can't be out there making dumb decisions that are going to reflect poorly on you and on your entire community. And so that was something that I took away then in a
Yeah.
way that in some ways I recognize is unfair, right? Like no one should have to represent an entire community or even feel like they should. And at the same time, I found something really powerful in this understanding that through simple actions, I could change the way that people felt about people who look like me. I could challenge their assumptions. I could show them a different version of what it means to be me. And that felt like I had immense power in my hands that I wouldn't have had otherwise.
And how old were you when you went through that experience? Because you're right, there's a level of beauty to it. And at the same time, it feels like there's a level of immense pressure to put on a young man's shoulders at that point in your life to uphold your entire people through your actions.
Yeah. I mean, it is complex, and I'll say, different people experience it differently. And for me, even now, I see it as an opportunity. I find agency in it. I love it, and I have friends who don't. And so, people experience it very differently. I was in middle school then, and in the years since, I mean, I've kind of made this my life's work, right? Like it's kind of what I do, and so I feel privileged that I get to do this, but it also feels like it's not an accident, that it's something that I found joy in and found meaning in, and it's something that I've continued to do over the years.
And Simran, I want to throw one more question at you from the book before we wrap up with a final four questions. And it's how you end it in the way you ask us, the reader, to think about our lives when you say, how are you using your gifts, time, talent, and treasure to help serve those around you? To put it more bluntly, what might you do to become less of a burden on this earth and help bring more light into the world? And why is that so important as you finish the book for our listeners to think about in their own life journey?
Yeah, I appreciate it. There's this line that's coming to my mind in Sikh scripture. I don't share it in the book, I don't think. "Hey Sarira Meriya is jag mein aaye ke kya tud karam kamaya." Hey, it's talking to the self and saying, hey self, hey body, what have you accomplished having come into this world? Like what have you come to do? Kya tud karam kamaya, and what have you accomplished? And part of it, and I think this is something that a lot of us can resonate with, part of it is understanding our purpose. What is your purpose in life? And what steps are you taking towards that purpose? And we could all define our purpose differently. Our journeys can look different, our steps can look different, but I think that the openness of the question to say, hey, why are you here? And what are you doing to accomplish that? I think it's so easy to lose sight of that, and the constant question. And I've benefited from this so much through our philosophy, like the constant question of what's the point? Like, what are you trying to do? What are you contributing? And I also, in this line that I wrote that you shared, I try and mimic some things that I see to be really effective rhetorically in Sikh scripture, which is you say it in a gentle way, and you also say it in a very sharp way. And it's, what have you accomplished? Like, what are you trying to do? And also, how are you not going to be a burden on this earth? Which is another way to say, like, how are you going to get more than you receive? And yeah, I understand that it comes out a little pointedly, but I think that's part of the need here, is to recognize that, like, we're not going to do this without a little pushing. And I'm hoping to be a friend and a compatriot in this journey, and encouraging folks to move forward in the way that I hope that they'll push me to move forward too.
And the beauty about it is you're not necessarily saying, here's what you should be doing. It's what is your purpose and what are you doing about it? And so now the ball's in their court. Oh, well, if I say I have a purpose, I guess I should be living it. So thank you, brother, for pushing me to live my purpose is a beautiful way to look at it. And so a final, you have time for a rapid fire 4 questions?
Yeah, sure. That sounds fun.
All right. What's one book that's had an immense impact on your life?
Man, there are tons. I read way too much. The one that I read when I was in, I think, first year of college that really started to help me understand what was happening with regard to race and justice issues was the autobiography of Malcolm X. That was the first time I read a book where I was like, yeah, this guy gets it. And so, yeah, that one really, really changed me.
Okay, I got to check that out. What's on the bookshelf right now that you're really enjoying?
I'll tell you what's literally right in front of me. This is The Persuader by Nand Giridhar Das, but he's looking at strategies for what's called At the Front Lines of the Fight for Hearts, Minds, and Democracy. But he's offering strategies on how we get people on board, the importance of engaging people who are different from us, and ensuring that we're not shortchanging people just because of, we disagree with their politics or we disagree with their religious background or whatever, which, as we've been talking about today, it's easier said than done. And so he's trying to give direct strategies on how to do that. So it's pretty cool. I'm enjoying it.
Oh, I love that. What's one thing that Simran has spent less than $1,000 on in the last 12 to 18 months that has left you thinking, wow, I really wish I had bought that earlier?
Oh, well, this is I'm going to shoot myself in the foot here, but AirPods.
AirPods. Well, you're not alone. There's a lot of us. There's a lot of us that give that answer.
I'm a huge fan, but then I lost them. I lost my case, and now I'm like, I was happy that I made the investment once, but do I trust myself with another round? So I feel like I don't deserve them yet. One day, but not yet.
And the better part is there's always better ones coming out. So when you feel like you deserve them again, you'll have a better pair. And did you test out the Find My device and you weren't able to get them?
Yeah, I did try the Find My. It didn't work, unfortunately.
Okay.
Left them in a tab in New York, so it happens.
Oh. Yeah, that hurts. Because this show is about growth, for you, what's one mindset shift, behavior shift, or habit you've adopted that's had an oversized impact on your life, Simran?
One I share in the book that I've been thinking about a lot the last couple of weeks with my daughters actually is about gratitude. So taking time every day to just stop and reflect on the things we're grateful for. So we're not just taking everything for granted and focusing on the negative. So yeah, the gratitude practice has been a really nice one for me.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. At this stage, we've gone pretty wide and deep on sections of the book. Is there anything you want to make sure that we get across to the listeners before we tie things up?
No, this sounds great. Yeah, it was pretty comprehensive. Appreciate it. And I appreciate you reading the book too. It was a fun conversation.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that. And where can our listeners find you?
My website is simranjeetsingh.org. I used to be on Twitter a lot. My name's Simran on there. I'm there occasionally now. Other social media, I'm Sikh Prof, SIKHPROF.
You had to have got on Twitter very, very early. For you to just be able to use your first name, that is legendary. There, everyone else is like this, that, I am. But exactly. Just your first name. Like you were early adopter. I love it. All right, perfect. We'll have all that in our show notes. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.
If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.